and thank you for coming today. And to Maureen and Joe, Joe Cox's murder was an awful moment at the end of a period of, or in the midst of a period of time that brought back a lot of memories of racism and incidents that we thought we'd left behind. I mean, it coincides with obviously everything happening in America today. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So for the last 2 decades, I've been working largely as a producer in interactive and digital media. And now I've decided I'm taking a bit of a break. I've just moved from London to Bristol, which is my hometown, to write stories and also start working completely different pathway as a mental health support worker in the Priory in lieu of studying psychology. When I agreed to doing this talk, I hadn't really considered the full implications of deep dive into the worst aspects of my life. Writing this hasn't been easy, but now it's about to be released and I'm about to speak. It does feel cathartic. I haven't really held back. I just wanted to be honest about the things I've experienced. What's really interesting about today is it's the 19th of June, which in America is known as Juneteenth. And this is the date the last enslaved African American was emancipated 155 years ago in 1865. The British abolished slavery even earlier in 1833. And what's especially sad right now is that despite the auspicious date, we can all see that racial discrimination is embedded so deeply in society, it continues, supported largely by unconscious thought and pernicious structures. But today I'm not going to talk in depth about Black Lives Matter, the campaign against police brutality that began in 2014 and became a global force for change in 2020. I won't even talk about the ongoing case of Sheku Bayu, whose family have been fighting over 5 years for justice following his death in Scottish police custody, or the myriad of other UK deaths in custody written off as suicide or cause of death unknown. What I am going to talk about is how racist thoughts follow me every step of every day, how I am not allowed to be just me because the color of my skin is loaded with a spiteful prejudgment that negates my personality and abilities. I'm going to start with a poem that is both a dream and a nightmare. The title of the poem is The Benefits of Segregation. Own schools, own shops, own TV stations, newspapers, banks, and law firms. Own restaurants, clubs, music, and bars. Own homes, land, and farms. In this utopia, no one immediately assumes you're evil. Security guards don't always follow you. No one calls the police if you're walking or running down the street or sitting on a wall. What matters is who you are inside, not your skin color. So a bit of backstory. I was born in the early 70s in Bristol. My father and mother are both Jamaican. My mum was 17 when she traveled alone to the UK on invitation of the Queen. After arriving in Sheffield to complete her nursing training, this was my mum's first experience of being an outsider. In ice-cold Sheffield, only one peer welcomed her. Mum spent most weekends and holidays with this young woman's family, as she got used to abuse and patients refusing to be cared for by her. While my mum was in Sheffield, a white doctor asked her to marry him. She said no. She thought their lives would be too hard. She left Sheffield soon after. She moved to Bristol and met my father. My father joined the British Army in his teens in Jamaica, and he traveled around the world, including Africa and the Middle East. His first experience of being an outsider came when he left the army and settled in Bristol. This was the era of no blacks, no dogs or Irish, of British bus boycotts where black men were forced to take direction because they needed to work. I keep wondering what it is about buses and discrimination. As I was writing this, I remembered that I've never in my life seen a black driver behind the wheel of a National Express coach, ever. My father struggled to find work at his education and aspiration level. He'd come from a family of professionals and business owners who attended private schools in Jamaica. He struggled to fit and became frustrated. Mum kicked him out when I was about 2 or 3, and he left the UK for America when I was 10. He got a job in engineering and worked for that company until he retired. And while working, he studied and got a first in computer science. So I'm going to relay now the first incident I remember of racism. I was in junior school. I was 6 years old. I lived with my mum, my 2 brothers, and my grandmother. My grandmother came to England because she missed her daughter, and so she left the country that she loved to be near her and care for us. Gran was practical and generous and loved the Catholic Church. She loved growing fruit and vegetables in our garden, cooking and baking, crime fiction, painting pictures of birds, crochet, and brewing wine and beer. Gran would have found 2020 intriguing in a biblical Old Testament kind of way. Her large Bible's pages often hid a book by Nostradamus. She really loved those kind of prophecies. Anyway, one day, while Mum was working at the hospital, Gran took me to swimming lessons. As the pool didn't have many cubicles, we had to share one with one of my white friends from school. My friend's mother dressed her fast and rushed out, then came running back saying she couldn't find her purse. Gran swiftly finished dressing me, and as she pulled the last item from the hook, we saw the woman's purse hanging up. Gran ordered me to wait and not touch a thing, then she ran. I didn't understand why she would go all the way to the entrance and back. So being helpful and saving time, I pulled the purse off the peg and ran after them. Gran didn't speak to me again until we got home. I'd never seen Gran angry before, and I never saw it again. She told me loud and clear, "These people think we are thieves." I needed her to see that the purse was precisely where she put it when she came in. I was so upset and ashamed, I went upstairs to the bathroom to drown myself. I filled the sink, stood on the stool, held my head under water for as long as I could. When that failed, I ran away on my bicycle. I remember it was raining. I hid in the playground beneath the climbing frame. And when I finally came home, there was another reason for Gran to be angry with me, but she wasn't. She didn't speak. And when Mum got home, she sat me down and explained racism to me. I was 6. In most senses, we had an idyllic childhood. We lived in a new-built 3-bed house in a small close in Barton Hill, a white working-class area in the centre of Bristol. We had a surprising amount of space and freedom and lots of people to play with. But this was the 70s, turning into the 80s, an era of growing unemployment, conservative rule, and social dissatisfaction. As time passed, shops closed, gardens became overgrown, and National Front graffiti bloomed. We had NF and skinheads in our school, National Front. They were friendly in school, but outside we were wary. Some of them carried flick knives and Stanley knives. One day I went to the shops alone. I rode there on my red bike, so I must have been about 10 years old because it was before I got my BMX. At this point, an adult male skinhead glared at me and shouted, "Nigger." I paddled fast, and from a safe distance, I told him to piss off and raise my middle finger. So around this time, my oldest brother joined the army, the British Army. And we used to write to each other every month. And as I just entered my teens and I had it wasn't about that time. So a bit later, he was in the army 13 years. So I was entering my teens, I started getting spots. I felt uglier than usual because my skin was always scarred. I told my brother, and when he came home from leave, he had a gift for me. He had 2 large pots of face cream. I used one for a week, and every time I did, my skin burned. So I read the small print. It was a skin lightening cream, basically bleach. From that day, I silently decided to accept my skin and instead turned my attention instead to my nose. I studied its bulbous width in the mirror, imagining what I'd do if Mum won the pools and could afford plastic surgery for me. As far as I knew, the only vision of beauty I saw reflected was in white imagery. My brother left the army soon after a term in Northern Ireland. He came back one day with a black eye. It was something inside the army compound, nothing outside, and he no longer understood whose side he was supposed to be on. So in secondary school, I went to a Catholic secondary school. I was one of only a handful of Black children in a school of 500, and I wanted to be a psychologist. However, when I shared my dream with the careers tutor, they told me to lower my sights and consider secretarial college. I hadn't thought about this incident until 2 weeks ago when my niece, who loves science, said that when she told her tutor her science study dreams, he told her to lower her sights. This is modern, this is Bristol. She goes to Cathedral, round the corner from the statue of Colston. I shared my experience with her and urged her to work hard and fight this race-defined limiting perspective on her abilities. She thanked me profusely. It's important for us to share our experiences with each other so we can learn, so we can move on, and so we can gain strength from each other. You know, research, anyway. While I was still in school, we had work experience. And in school, you know, after I decided I wasn't going to be a psychologist, I decided to be a chef. So I was obsessed with cooking shows, and I spent a lot of time with my in the kitchen cooking. I submitted my request. I said I wanted to work in a restaurant kitchen. They assigned me to the cafe in Littlewood's department store. And I was so disappointed because they never made anything from scratch, and they made mashed potatoes from packets, where we grew vegetables and fruit in our back garden, and everything we ate came from raw. But what was worse than the lack of opportunity to learn was the uniform. It stated skin-colored tights, so I wore black. They told me this was the wrong color and tomorrow I must wear the right type. The next day, I wore brown. They dragged me down to the shop floor and ordered me to buy beige tights. I wore them for an hour, then I walked out. No one ever asked me why I didn't complete the work experience week. I carried on anyway with education, even though I'd given up inside, and I did my A-levels, but I didn't even consider going to university. I spent a few years working in restaurants. I went traveling and discovered photography. With this new direction, I excelled, and during the length of a degree, I completed some courses in film and TV, secured a commission from Channel 4, and directed a number of short films. Despite many letters of recommendation and interviews, no Bristol production company, including the BBC, would employ me. I heard many excuses, all different. In the end, I realized the truth was more explicit and yet more nebulous than bad luck. I lowered my sights. I got a job in the finance team in a charity and watched my peers rise. But I'm kind of stubborn or stupid, maybe. So I tried again and secured a job as a runner in a post-production company. After a year learning the ropes, I got a job in London as an edit assistant on a gardening show, and from here I carved a career in digital and interactive. On one show, an Australian secretary screamed at me in front of my team, the team I was managing, because I asked her politely why I hadn't been paid when it was her job to process invoices. She called me aggressive and said she'd get me fired. In another role, an Australian screamed at me in front of the entire team because of something petty my work colleagues did regularly. I stayed at home to read a block of papers this deep that I was due to talk about that day. This moment followed months of nitpicking, demeaning comments, undermining authority, and sidelining. I got her removed from managing people. But in neither situation did I mention racism. But I knew the condescending tone of their voices and lack of respect for my experience, age, and professionalism were based on the fact that they assumed they were better than me and entitled to put me in my place. I'd seen it many times before and saw it innumerable times after. I spent 8 years in one role. I was passed over time and again for promotions and refused responsibility. My sense of self-belief and confidence ebbed, and my once golden reputation became hazy. I was too insecure to move on, but I knew they wouldn't fire me because I ticked a diversity box. I believed I was useless and no one would employ me. I didn't even apply for jobs anymore. At my lowest ebb, I cried every single day, multiple times. I hid under my desk or I ran to the toilet. During this period, I was eating lunch in the canteen on a table of 8 when a white man loudly questioned why I speak so well instead of ghetto, like the girl on his floor. He genuinely believed that Black people only appear in one form, poor and uneducated, basically stupid. I'd been asked that question many times before, and I used to feel obliged to answer, but not anymore. I told him in no uncertain terms the origin of his statement lay in racist ideas. I wrote the following poem in the wake of Black Lives Matter's protests after they turned violent. The title is Ugly. I saw ugly unfold. Today it breaks my sleep, but it once broke my soul. So excuse me if I appear cynical, but I saw ugly unfurl, replacing ugly with uglier. I saw ambitions fall behind invisible walls. I saw shells that once were full. I saw lazy grow from withdrawal, silence replace a strong voice, hunched shoulders minimizing the tall, soft voices replacing gravel, eyes lowering before tears could fall, and through it all, I saw shape shifts, but I rarely saw fit. So excuse me if I appear cynical, but I don't believe diversity initiatives change anything. It takes years to dismantle automatic thoughts. It took centuries for Black to become a dirty word. Until then, what should I do if I won't accept being a victim of pity or abuse? I don't really understand how people can't see the purposely narrow view perpetuated by racist ideas. Black people, like white, exist in all forms, educated and uneducated, rich, middle class and poor, happy and sad, loud and quiet. Some grow up in cities and some in the countryside. Some love reggae music, some don't. But Africans born in Africa don't accept racism at all. The majority didn't grow up thinking they were worth less than anyone else, and they won't accept this view. So we move forward a little bit to 2016, which was a big year. It was the year the UK voted to leave the EU, and the year my mum was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and moved into a care home. She was the only resident of colour on her floor, and the TV was always on the news channel. One day I found her sitting in her room, extremely agitated. She told me some of the women had said terrible things, called her names and used words she hadn't heard in many years. At this time, she still had patches of linear thought, and although she couldn't repeat exactly what they said, she told me enough for me to know what it meant. I reported the incident to the managers and requested that they don't put the news on anymore. The campaign for Brexit centred on immigration and closing borders. The immigrants they showed in adverts largely had brown skin and arrived on illegal boats from France. My mum lives in Bristol, a predominantly white city, like most towns in the UK. At the end of 2017, while I was still living in London, opposite a park in Brixton, and I got a dog. He's upstairs with my friends, so he doesn't bark. One morning, I was walking Squeak and saw that someone had drawn a black body hanging from a noose with the word "Die Niggers" written beneath on the shelter in the park. The first park keeper I saw was a tall, ever-smiley Somalian. I will never forget his face after I showed him. All the joy disappeared from his eyes. His shoulders dropped and his arms fell limp at his sides. I waited with him while he painted over the murderous depiction of us. In that park, I often walked with a white woman married to a Jamaican man. He drove the bus she rode to work in a hospital when she was a nurse. They have 3 children and 2 grandkids. She told me that 2 years ago, out of the blue, the Home Office informed him that he didn't belong here and had to go back where he came from. They sent the same letter to his 5 siblings, all of whom came to the UK during Windrush on invitation from the Queen, same as my mum. As a result of that letter, he lost his job on the buses. He couldn't work and didn't qualify for benefits. He and his siblings now have leave to remain, but so far, they've received no compensation for his lost job, earnings, and lost self-esteem. The week before I moved back to Bristol, in June, last week, I attended the protest and witnessed the fall of Colston's statue. I didn't want to go to the protest, but my white friend, really close friend, convinced me to go. I had 3 reasons for not wanting to go. One was COVID, I'm needing to see my mum. The second was I honestly didn't believe it was down to me to dismantle racism, because racist ideas don't live in my head. Racist ideas live unconsciously in most people's minds and consciously in the minds of those who manipulate the division of people perpetuated by 19th century myths of race and eugenics. I also didn't want to go because I didn't want to get in trouble with the police. But I went. We were standing beside the police when we saw the noose tied around Colston's neck. We moved forward. As a statue fell, I looked away. I was scared. I was fearful of how the police would respond, scared of the vengeful violence this act would inevitably unleash among those who consciously support racist thoughts, words, and deeds. The friend I attended the protest with popped in while I was writing this speech. She asked me why we never talked about racism before. I told her I was ashamed, that I feared the pain of my lived experience would lead to pity, or that I wouldn't be believed. This is what I accept as a Black person living in the UK. So in conclusion, I used to wish my mother and father hadn't come to England and I'd never been born, but I'm still here. This is the first time I've shared many of the incidents I've talked about, and I'm doing it in the hope that it will help people understand that racism isn't always overt, violent, or conscious. It is embedded in the language, history, and thought. Despite the 2003 Human Genome Project finding no evidence that the groups we commonly call races have any distinct unifying genetic characteristics, we still employ the word. If it bears no truth, and the only reason it continues to be used is to uphold racist ideas for propaganda, it is employed to justify abuse and murder. In 1516, Sir Thomas More, incidentally the name of my secondary school, wrote a series of essays entitled Utopia. In one, he argued that his ideal society would have slaves formed of local convicts and condemned criminals, much like the American prison system today and increasingly like it is in the UK. Between 1730 and 1790, the modern concept of race emerged as a product of colonial enterprises. The first definition of race is a competition. Ideas of racial superiority emerged in the 19th century following the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859. His half-cousin transformed his ideas about survival of the fittest into eugenics and racial hygiene, the belief system made famous by Adolf Hitler's Nazi movement. American President Theodore Roosevelt was a big advocate of eugenics. He referred to white Americans as the forward race and minorities as the backward race. These theories have in recent times been supported by Boris Johnson and his key advisor, Dominic Cummings. They believe the strongest will rise and ignore the lack of an even playing field. Racist and, I'll say it very quickly, but won't go there too often, classist ideas are deeply embedded in the minds of the ruling classes because many of their ancestors benefited from slavery. These people overwhelmingly govern our lives, run the media, economy, and businesses. They set the school curriculum, build prisons, sit as judges, and head the police force. They told the world Black faces and hair are ugly and white the only acceptable face of beauty. They told the world Black is eponymous with being a criminal and being stupid. Unless we as individuals become conscious of our thoughts, words, and actions, they will continue to be habits that shape our character and destiny, and no one wants to be remembered for silently enabling abuse and murder. It took 400 years to embed racist ideas in public minds, and now Black people exist in a chronic state of fear that is as traumatizing as being hunted as wild animals, sold like cattle, and beaten like dogs, except the English are actually very nice to their dogs. Accepting and appreciating difference, eliminating aggression and violence, and increasing empathy are, to me, the markers of a civilized, spiritually connected society. I hope it doesn't take another 400 years for people to see that racist ideas and the violence they unleash are more deadly than the plague we've just experienced. So I'll end with a final, very short poem. It's called Ancestral Connections. When you've been stolen and flung across seas unknown to a land where you are considered less than human, our ancestors sigh low and cry high. And we carry their screams forever in our hearts, forever in our minds, forever in our souls. And that's it from me. Thank you.